The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. It's a scene we've all seen unfold before. A hurricane or ice storm or other natural disaster strikes a community, disrupting power, transportation, and our market economy. Items that are normally available are now in short supply and great demand. And then someone starts selling gas or ice or portable generators, but for sky-high prices. This is commonly referred to as price gouging and infuriates many Americans. President George W. Bush once referred to price gougers as the moral equivalent of looters after Hurricane Katrina. Economists, though, approach this matter very differently, and our assessment of the effects and the efforts of price gougers affect how we may want to evaluate this activity. Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about the economics and ethics of price gouging are Dr. Dan Smith, the Associate Director of the Johnson Center, and Troy University student Ashley Lynn. Welcome back to the show, Dan, and welcome to the show, Ashley.
Thank you.
Before we get started, Ashley, why don't you take a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a senior here at Troy University, double majoring in economics and math. And in the fall, I'll be starting my PhD program in economics at Florida State, which I'm very excited about.
And we're very happy for your opportunity to go on and study at Florida State. And I just want to mention to the viewers that last year you won a prize in our Sorrell College of Business undergraduate research fair and for your paper on this topic, which is why we have you on here today to talk about this topic, right?
Yes, sir.
So let's get started here, and let's make sure we make sure everybody's completely aware of exactly what we mean here when we're talking about price gouging, because there could be some unclarity. Sometimes people will use the term somewhat casually or referring to just a price in the supermarket as price gouging, but there are such things as price gouging laws and so forth, and it refers to a somewhat more restricted activity. So tell us a little bit about the type of activity that we have involved here.
Okay, well, to me, the things that really signify price gouging would be higher prices, obviously, but they normally come after a natural disaster, so hurricane, tornado, things like that, or in the case of like a medication that is required for survival. Some people do consider higher prices on medication of that sort as price gouging as well.
And although people will commonly refer to this as a situation of great need for the products, economists sort of prefer the term inelastic demand. It's a little more antiseptic, but it also has a little bit more of a concrete meaning that, well, what exactly would that mean then?
Yeah, so all it means is that people have a really inflexible demand for that good. They really need this good. It's an emergency situation. They're vulnerable because they need it. It could be they need medicine, and after a disaster they may need ice to keep that medicine cold. They might need gas to put their tanks so they can take their pregnant wife to the hospital. It means that they just have an absolute demand for this good, and that's why people have so repulsed by price gouging, is because they perceive it as taking advantage of these people in these vulnerable circumstances.
Where you're still going to buy the good even if it goes up in price, or even if it's much more expensive than it would be otherwise. So let's start to get into this whole issue of the popular dislike for price gouging. I mentioned President Bush's comparison of price gouging to looting. Now, I understand what looting is, and I understand what's bad about looting, because you're actually stealing from people or stealing from stores in the aftermath of a disaster. Now, what exactly are price gougers doing? And because it doesn't, on the surface, are they doing anything that actually is the same as looting?
I would say definitely not, because even when people are considering something being price gouged, they're actually voluntarily buying that product, so they're not being forced into anything. So even if they do buy it, that's by their own choice. And so I think that's something that should definitely be taken in consideration. If they think the price is too high and it's not a necessity at the time, then they don't have to spend the money. They can wait until the prices drop back. But I think why people have such a bad outlook on it is it's because it's when people are in a vulnerable state, and so they think people are being taken advantage of, when really price gouging is the market's way, in the sense of making sure the goods are allocated to who needs them most. Because if someone needs insulin to be iced and their power's out, and that's the only way their insulin's going to stay good, they're going to value that ice a lot more in that situation than a day before when the ice was just used to keep their drink cold. Now that ice value has skyrocketed to that individual person. So me, who I don't need insulin, so that ice isn't as valuable to me as the person who does need it. And so price gouging, in its sense, the higher prices, the person that needs it more is going to spend the money on it more, and it's kind of fixing itself in that manner.
So just to offer, again, another concrete example of this activity, Professor Mike Munger has written a story telling of an instance in the aftermath of a hurricane in North Carolina from a few years ago that I think really gives a very concrete case of price gouging activity. So if you could, tell us a little bit about Mike Munger's case here.
Okay, well, it's pretty simple. There was 4 guys who witnessed, I think it was a hurricane, and so they knew that there was a need for ice because ice had been sold out, and they were in an area that hadn't been harmed as much, so they had access to a ice truck that could keep it cold, so they rented out the truck. They bought 500 bags for about under $2 a piece. It was higher, close to $2, and then they sold it to people for $12 a bag once they got to Raleigh. And they ended up being arrested, and people cheered and applauded them, which is kind of crazy because everyone was made worse off in that situation. And I think some people don't take into account that $12 seems like a lot, but they also had to pay the price to cover the ice truck. They had to pay the gas to get there. They had to pay for their time, compensation, to make it worthwhile. Even though it is the goodness of their heart, it's not really fair to make them worse off to help someone else. And so then once those prices were covered, then they charged the higher price. But in the long run, if they wouldn't have been arrested, it would have created competition, and the prices probably would have gone down. And so being arrested really was probably the worst solution that could have happened in that scenario. So these people took an entrepreneurial action. They saw the opportunity. They went there. And I might add to the story, a detail I remember from this case was that they actually had to take chainsaws with them to cut some trees and branches that were blocking the highway so that they could get to Raleigh and get in with the ice. So that they took a lot of effort and a lot of action to go there to deliver ice, and they made it available, and they were selling it, and then they got arrested. And we'll get into the legal part of that in a little bit. But so now we have a good sense of what we're analyzing, and we know that this draws a lot of negative reactions from people. But let's get into this action in a little more detail, because to really assess it, we need to think about what are some of the components of what's going on here. One thing to first note is people are in distress after a hurricane or after an earthquake, after a disaster, or in that case, even in the case of a pharmaceutical, if they have a disease. But did the price gougers do anything to put them in harm?
It's important to reflect on this. I think economists really take a hard-nosed approach to this and saying, well, actually, it wasn't the gas station owner, it wasn't the person selling the ice that made the price rise, it was the disaster itself. The disaster itself is what caused demand to increase. Usually demand for ice is going to increase after a natural disaster, power's out, people don't have access to refrigeration, so it's going to cause a natural increase in demand. And on the supply side, oftentimes a natural disaster will disrupt traditional supply lines, and you won't be able to ship the normal goods in through traditional means as quickly. So you may have a supply shock and a demand shock. And those natural conditions are gonna just using basic supply and demand analysis are going to cause the price to go up for those goods. So it's important not to blame the actual person raising the price. They're just conveying the message that the conditions of supply and demand have changed, and therefore this good is more scarce, more people want it, the market price has to go up.
And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here, because it's not like a case where, if you can imagine, like a doctor poisoned their patient, so now they need the antidote. So you've poisoned them, and now it's like, oh, well, how much are you going to pay? Are you willing to pay for the antidote? Because you've already taken an action to put them in a situation where they need the antidote to the poison, and that's clearly not what's going on here, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to reflect on how, like, gas station owners actually charge for the price of gas that they sell. They base it off of replacement cost. So where people say it's unfair is they see, well, the price of gas is $2 the day before the storm, then the day of storm it jumps up to $8. Well, that definitely seems unfair. It's the same gas. Well, the gas station owner is saying, okay, what's the cost to fill my tanks with gas again so I can provide it to more customers? And if that cost goes up, well, to refill their gas station tanks, they need to let the price of each gallon they sell go up in order so that they can replace it.
In the aftermath of a disaster, I think, also provides a good illustration of a point we make in economics, often quite generally or dryly, about how knowledge in economics is very dependent on space and time, or place contingent. And if you could explain a little bit what this means, and how it is that time and place matters for goods.
I think an easy example would be a bottle of water. If I went to buy it right now, leaving the set, I might pay $2 max. And that would be my convenience fee of just going into a store. But if I get lost in the desert, and I've been in the desert for a day or a day and a half without any water, and someone comes up to me, I would probably be willing to pay way more than $2. Actually, I know I'd be willing to pay way more than $2, because at that place in time, that water is like my lifeline. And so I'm going to value it obviously a lot more. And the time and place mattered about how much I valued it. Right now, I don't value it that much. But in a different time, different place, the desert, I value it a lot more. So it's the same thing in a natural disaster. I know before it, you don't know what harm is going to be caused to you. So every day, things that you use like food, ice, your refrigerator, you probably don't even think about them. But once you lose it, you start to value them a lot more. So that time and place has changed, your situation has changed, and then so your valuation is going to change based off that.
And it's important to point out that when the power was out in Raleigh, North Carolina, after the disaster, that power might be out for 2 or 3 days. When people got the ice is very important. Getting the ice in another week when the price might be back to $2 isn't really what you need. You need the ice where you are when you need it, and that's everything. A big part of what creates value in economics, right? It's not just what the good is, but when and where you have it. And do you have it when you need it, and in the form that you need it, right?
Yeah, and I would add in that from an outsider's perspective, it's really hard to assess what that time and place is without that price signal. Because outsiders, and you can see this through in-kind donations, we see this with natural disasters all the time, is that people donate goods that actually people in the disaster area don't really need. So to know specifically what those people in that disaster circumstance need at that time, you really need the price signals to go up and down to say, okay, we really desperately need this. And companies like Walmart have gotten really efficient at that, combing through sales data, finding that of all things, people prefer strawberry Pop-Tarts after a natural disaster. So they stock up water, and they stock up strawberry Pop-Tarts and other items that they know customers are going to want following a natural disaster. So you can't, people, not economists, should be very careful about discounting the importance of that information conveyed through the price system.
And I think that gets us an important role that the prices are providing there, because I don't know, let's go back to the example of the young college students the enterprising college students from North Carolina. Now, maybe, I don't know if $12 was actually going to cover all of their costs, or maybe allowed them to make some profit. And as for one sense, we could say they might be entitled to earn some profit because they came up with this clever idea to go ahead and do something. But even if it does involve some profit, would people have been better off if they had sold the good, if they had been selling their ice at a price that wouldn't allow them to make any profit? I mean, does that high price, even if it's above the level of cost, still play an important role?
I think it's good to always step back and ask yourself, is it good to take away someone's best option, even if it's an option that you do not agree with? And that can be very hard depending on your own personal beliefs and morals, which will change depending on the person. That's very subjective. And it can be easy for us to say, no, that shouldn't be allowed because it's not the best option to us. And so we're not fully considering it. And I think that, the price might seem a little unfair, but in the long run, was it $12 or $10, however much they charge for the bag of ice, at the end of the day, there was people who really needed that. They responded to knowing that they were out of ice, so they were taking the role, stepping up, trying to give a service. And yes, like I might say it's unfair, but people that needed ice got the ice, and at the end of the day, what was needed was provided. And so I think at the end of the day, they got what they needed. And $2 in the scheme of things isn't enough to arrest someone, or keep people from having it because you subjectively didn't agree with what it was being sold for.
And I think at some level you might need a very high price like that to make people stop and realize, hey, that ice is really expensive, and it really is the market's way of trying to say, you better have a really good reason for using this ice, right?
I know that in the same article they mentioned hotel rooms in a natural disaster, especially hurricanes, and if you live in an area where, you can be in flood danger, a lot of people move out, and so hotel rooms around the area skyrocket sometimes, and people think that's a bad thing. Like, can you imagine making these people not be able to afford a safe place to stay? But in reality, I know that some families of 4, for example, could afford more than one room at a normal cost. So they might get 2 rooms for the ideal of comfort, when it's very practical for 4 people to stay in a hotel room if there's 2 beds in there. But when the price goes up, even the wealthiest person is going to step back and think, is that necessary? Like, do I need to pay that extra money for comfort? Or in this situation, do I just get 1 room? Do we all stay in there? And then that opens up a room for someone else. And so the higher prices also makes people, I think, realize how much money they're spending per se. They don't overspend and overbuy. They buy more what they need because the price is higher, so they're having to recognize it more. And so then it leaves more for other people, which is basically allocating goods for people. Is
market's way of saying this isn't a day to be comfortable. It's a day to get everybody out of harm's way and make sure that everybody needs to get out of harm's way has a hotel room. There's another element of the when we go to assess the activity of price gougers after a disaster to take into account, and that is the fact that those gentlemen in North Carolina could have just stayed at home and continued to watch hurricane coverage on their television. Their area hadn't been affected by the hurricane. They probably still had power. They could have watched what was happening on TV. Would it be wrong for somebody to sit back in the comfort of their home and watch TV?
Yes, so I actually use examples like this in class when I discuss price gouging. And what I usually do is I find some recent example of price gouging going on, preferably in the southeast region, so it's nearby, that students could theoretically get in a car and deliver ice to that area. And I ask, at a price of $1 a bag, how many of you would rent a truck and take a few days off from college or work, drive this truck over and deliver ice to this area that needed it? No hands are raised. And then I keep raising the price. I say at $2, at $3, at $4. And once I started getting up to the $10, $15 range, then people are starting, well, per bag, then it'd make it worth it for me to take that trip. But what's ironic is those people that do that are the ones doing the most to help out these disaster victims. They're the ones being entrepreneurial, taking the risk. It's not guaranteed. I mean, I certainly wouldn't know anything about renting a refrigerated car and trucking ice a couple states over and taking chainsaws. You wouldn't even know if you're able to get in. So there's definitely an element of risk in there. We're tarring and feathering the people doing the most to help these people when we certainly never tar and feather the person that just sits at home and says, you know what, I'm not going to do anything. In fact, a lot of people probably have some spare ice in their fridge during natural disasters, and very few of us get off the couch and deliver it to that area. Well, that seems worse. Offering ice at no price seems even worse than offering ice at $12, $15 a bag. So it seems very odd from a philosophical sense that most of our criticism is against the people that are doing more than the rest of us.
So I think we've offered a number of good considerations, things to think about here, but still many people think that there's something wrong with this charging an excessive price after a disaster. And so as a result, we see laws get passed. About 34 states, I believe, have a law restricting some form of price gouging. Now, does Alabama have such a law? And if so, it would seem like there's been some ambiguity in how we've been trying to exactly discuss price gouging here. How would you go about defining price gouging for a law, for instance?
I know that in Alabama, you can raise the price. It's price gouging if it's raised more than 25%, unless there's a reasonable cause to justify higher than 25%. But the problem with that is reasonable is very subjective. What's reasonable to me might not be reasonable to you, might not be reasonable to Dr. Smith. So how do you define that line? Like if I'm a business owner and I'm presented with this law, and I think, okay, well, this will be 30% is fair, and then I'm in trouble with the law, but I can say, hey, well, that was reasonable in my eyes. Like, how do you make that distinct? And I think that's a huge issue, because when you're talking about laws like this, you can't really leave it so subjective as reasonable, like, calls for more than that. Like, you have to go in more detail, because then there's really, we all could think of something different, and then I might be punished, but y'all might not. But I could truly believe that I was being reasonable in the situation. So it causes people to not want to act at all, because they're not going to want to put themselves in the case of getting arrested like the people.
Right.
So it's better for them just to not do anything, and then people will become worse off because of it. And to me, that's a more tragic outcome then.
And you really just think of that very much in terms of the general incentive for entrepreneurship for development ever, whether you talk about whether investing in a developing country where property rights are less secure, or you've got corruption, or whether you're acting in the aftermath of a disaster. Uncertainty is not a good for economic activity, is that?
Definitely not.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of stress on the supply side also. If you put in a price gouging law that says the price cannot rise like 25-30% above its normal everyday price, well, that prevents the usage of like paying workers overtime to like let's say Hurricane Katrina knocks out some offshore oil refineries and hurts the oil supply. There's increased demand for oil. Well, how does a gas station get more oil? Well, you got to pay truckers overtime to ship the oil in. You have to pay oil rig workers to work harder. You got to pay the people at the oil refineries to take on more production. Well, you can't afford to do that if your price isn't allowed to rise high enough. So it precludes the usage of emergency measures to drastically increase the supply to meet the needs of the people in that disaster area.
Would there be an alternative to passing laws to try to keep the prices from going up too much after a disaster?
Absolutely, it's competition. And going back to the Raleigh incident, if they would not have been arrested, then more people would have caught on and been like, hey, that's a good idea. They're offering ice. They might be making a slight profit. Well, we can go and I can sell it for $11 and still cover my cost and make an even smaller profit. And then people are going to pay $11 versus $12. And then after that, someone's going to say, well, what about $10? Then they'll really buy mine. And so when you do this, prices are getting driven back down because that's the beauty of competition. The cheapest price for the same good and the same convenience is what's going to be paid for. But if there's no competition, you literally can pay or charge almost anything. And especially a case like natural disasters when people need the good. So competition is actually the perfect solution because then it's just the market's way of getting it down to a lower price. That's better for everyone. And then everyone's getting more of the good as well.
In high prices, when that natural disaster causes that price to increase, that's going to be the number one signal to say we need more competition. We need more entrepreneurs working to solve this. And that's going to allow the market mechanisms to work to drive that price back down.
And that also ends up driving businesses to think about recognizing the next time a disaster is looming, a hurricane's approaching, to realize if they remember what happened to prices after the case in the last disaster, recognize, hey, if we had extra ice available after this hurricane hit, we could actually sell it for a nice profit. And the prices help further to help prepare for the next disaster and make sure that Walmart takes steps to figure out what it is that people need that like to eat after a hurricane, make sure they ship that in, right?
Absolutely.
Now, we mentioned briefly earlier one other example where price gouging sometimes is brought up, and that's with regard to pharmaceuticals. There's a case of a couple of years ago of a drug called Daraprim, and that came to a lot of national attention that people thought of as a case of price gouging as well. So if you could refresh our memories, what was going on with this case of Daraprim?
Well, originally the pill cost about a little under $14 per pill, and then it skyrocketed to $750 per pill, which was a $5,000 price increase, which is huge, and that's normally a lot bigger price increase than we see normally when we're talking about price gouging and those topics. But that led because there's no competition right now to the drug. And it's not like ice where the most of us can live without it. This is a drug that literally holds people's lives in its hands pretty much. And so honestly, the price probably could have been raised. It's very valuable, and I'm not saying that huge price increase is something that I agree with or don't, but they saw the room where the price could increase because people needed it, their lives depended on it. They also realized that there was no competition, so that person either had to choose between possibly dying from not taking it or buying from them because there was no other option, and they took it. And so that was a lot of that.
Yeah, and I think important for this case is that the competition was artificially restricted by the FDA approval process. They approve a drug, and in this case, they didn't allow generic competition. So this drug maker literally had a monopoly on this particular drug, and the government was enforcing that monopoly. So it kind of highlights the importance of allowing a free market and allowing competition. If you restrict that competition, then people supplying goods that have inelastic demand can exploit customers. Though I would add in where this is right after a United Airlines recently kicked a passenger off a flight, and they were drug off the flight, and someone took a video of it, and customers were very irate, and their stock price has plummeted. I think it went down about 4% already, which represents millions of dollars in shareholder value. Even a company like this could lose shareholder value if customers get irate enough and send it around on social media and say we're going to use social pressure to fight against this company. So I think companies do keep this in mind when they're making plans.
Yeah, because I think that the Daraprim example certainly does just reinforce that whole point of competition. There was a lack of competition there in that case. Well, thanks very much for coming on and talk about this complicated and controversial topic and helping explain to us a little bit more how economists think about this topic. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.